We are very glad to have you here at this timely session. My name is Tavia Hearn. I'm the Interim Director for African Studies at Indiana University. I am also the Associate Director, and I direct K through 12 outreach. So for those of you who are very interested in this topic, if you want to reach out to us afterward, I will be putting my contact information in the chat. Thank you, Julie, co-Hoosiers. We have a number of individuals from Indiana here on the session with us. Today, I'm very pleased to have two individuals who have devoted their lives to working with Africans and to promoting African realities to Americans and others. They have lived lives of activist scholars. And so I'm incredibly pleased that they'll be able to work with you today. I am not going to spend a lot of time in introductions because we have those extensive bios for all of you. Rather, I want them to be able to present their information to you and then open it up for dialogue. So we are going to begin our session with Prexy or Roselle Nesbitt, who has spent his life again in activism with regards to human rights, both in the US and in Southern and Eastern Africa. And he is presently a presidential fellow for peace studies with Chapman College. And then we continue with Dr. Elizabeth Schmidt, who is has a doctorate in history and has worked throughout her life in a number of areas in Africa and was at Loyola University. So with that, let me welcome Prexy.
Thank you very much, Tavi, and good morning or good afternoon or good Zooming, whatever it is, to everybody who's on this. I'm very, very happy to have this opportunity to share with you. I've talked to African teachers, the teachers' workshops at ASA meetings before, largely in Chicago and Baltimore, I think in Los Angeles too once. So I'm very glad that Tavi made this opportunity available. I had a piece that I was on that's filmed on YouTube. I will just refer you to it. You can go to Prexy Nesbitt Solidarity YouTube, African Solidarity on YouTube, and you can find it. So let me get right to it because I want to get to us dialoguing more than anything else. I just finished a wonderful article in a little known magazine, as my students say, a zine, known as Monthly Review. It's not known well. The article is entitled Toward a Court of Solidarity by Elizabeth Kim in September of 1993. She opened up the heart of her article describing an act of solidarity when, in response to President Roosevelt's 1940s executive order interning all Americans of Japanese descent into the camps, a group of African Americans formed who then publicly, as a group, denounced the order. And in return for that, the FBI put them all on files that were files for subversive activity. The article continues and it discusses another act of solidarity between Koreans being in solidarity with Black people in the 1990s, around the whole period of what happened with Rodney King in Los Angeles and other things. So both of these initiatives really rang true to me because it rang to me of acts of solidarity that abounded in the 1980s and 90s that Betsy will tell you much more about, but they had to do with Southern Africa, and particularly with work trying to end the grip of apartheid racism and colonialism on Africa, and the contribution made to that by companies and other Western countries assisting the apartheid regime in that grip. And in that period, I was working very proudly, I might say, for the Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo. And I had the great pleasure to work very closely with one of the great leaders of that time, a man by the name of Samora Machel, who was the president of Mozambique and had led the Mozambican people in the struggle against Portuguese colonialism. He was a great friend of mine. He was an extraordinary speaker, and I always had just unending respect for him. If you have a chance, there's a little book that just came out from Ohio University Press done by the Isaacmans, Barbara and Alan. It's a little wonderful little book to use that's about Samora Machel and his life. And so as I was reading that article about these gestures of solidarity here in Southern California in the 1990s, I was reminded of the definition that Samora used to use. And these are his words. He said, international solidarity is not an act of charity. It is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains toward the same objectives. The foremost of these objectives is to assist in the development of humanity to the highest level possible. Solidarity is an assertion. We need an assertion like this right now in these times, is an assertion that no people is alone. No people is isolated in the struggle for progress. Solidarity is the conscious alliance of the progressive and peace-loving revolutionary forces in the common struggle against colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. In short, against exploitation of man by man. And this struggle, may it be in Asia, in Europe, or in America, or in Africa, wherever it is, it's the same struggle. It has common enemies, and its enemies are always principal, major. Solidarity has no race and no color, no gender, and its country has no frontiers. There is no solidarity just among Africans, no exclusively Asian solidarity, no European solidarity or white American solidarity, since the enemy of the people also has no country or no race. It's a very profound statement, if you get a chance to take a look at it. It has made me wonder as I reread this about the question of where the acts, the events, the undertakings of solidarity are today. Where are the voices of Asian, Latinx, women's organizations, Black organizations, men's organizations? Where are they today at a point when so many communities are under such grave siege? I raise this question at my own campus, where we are losing African American students because of the difficulty they're having surviving the environments on our campus. And I ask myself, where are these groups that should be expressing solidarity with so many groups that are under siege today? In my life, I've been very involved in organized labor. And organized labor is, I think, under great siege these days. I ask my students all the time about unions and organized labor, and many of them have never even heard of a union. There was an expression in organized labor, and I've worked in organized labor all over the world, that an injury to one is an injury to all. I think of things like the teacher strikes that took place across the United States a year or 2 years ago, and how much they were gaining in momentum on each other. I think about the kinds of difficulties that teachers have in the current period of COVID, the kind of issues they face, that all of you face, trying to teach in this period. And I think it's a call that we need much more solidarity, of the type of solidarity that the late Samora Machel was talking about. I won't say much more now. I prefer to be in dialogue with you all. And I want to say again to Tavi, my own expression of gratitude for organizing this, and to my dear friend Elizabeth Schmidt, who you'll hear from in just a minute, that I've had the pleasure to work with for many, many years. And our work has long ago transcended any kind of deliberateness. We just work in solidarity with each other all the time. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you. Is the floor mine for a minute now? Yeah, okay. All right, I'm going to share screen, and I always have problems with this, so if I don't do it right, bear with me for a minute. Okay. Okay, I don't see it again, Tavi. Do I need to open my PowerPoint? Let me open it. It disappeared again.
So once you go down to the share, if you hit the share screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to open it again.
Yes, click on your PowerPoint.
Yeah, okay. And it's open. I'm sorry. All right,
No, that's fine.
Screen. Okay. And there it is. All right. Yes, it got closed, I guess. Here we are.
And we do see it.
Yes. Okay. Good. And I want to share from the beginning. All right. I think I'm good now. All right. So what I'd like to do, Prexy gave such a wonderful introduction, and I should say that he is the person who got me started doing work on Africa way back in 1979. And I was in my early 20s, and he offered me a job doing research and writing for the campaigns against apartheid South Africa. And I often say to people that it's by chance that I'm doing work on Africa now. If Prexy had been doing work in support of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, I would be doing something in Central America. I wanted to work with this amazingly charismatic man. And he made me feel like, even though I was very young and just had a bachelor's degree, that I could take things on. I didn't have to have advanced degrees in order to have a voice that was powerful. And I did ultimately go on to grad school, as Tavi mentioned, and I've been teaching college since 1987. But that's something that I've taken with me with my own students. It's just this sense that they should feel empowered, that they can make a difference. And much of my writing, well, my earliest writing was for the anti-apartheid movement. Then I wrote the sort of scholarly monographs that university professors need to write. And more recently, I've tried to focus my research and writing again on topics that I think are important for Americans in the more general public to understand the role of foreign intervention in the conflicts that have been plaguing the African continent since the Cold War. So it's thanks to Prexy, really, that I'm doing this. Now, what I'd like to do today is talk about a couple campaigns. He mentioned the Southern African Solidarity Movement. I want to specifically focus on the anti-apartheid movement and one aspect of that. And then I want to move on to the Keystone XL pipeline protests in the Dakotas that affected Native Americans, and then link that up to the protests in the Niger Delta against foreign oil companies, and show similarities and also some of the solidarities that go on. So the first campaign that I want to focus on, again, I like Prexy, want to make sure we have time for a conversation. So I may have too much here, and if so, I'll try to edit it as I go. But the first campaign I want to talk about is the bank campaign, which Prexy was very, very involved in. I was not. I was doing work on corporate divestment and pressing for corporate withdrawal, but he was focusing on those things, but also on getting American banks, US banks, to stop making loans to apartheid South Africa. And what the bank campaign in the US realized was that the best way to really mobilize communities was to show them the linkages that Prexy talked about just now, the linkages between what the banks and corporations are doing in the US and what they're doing in Africa. And so the first thing that the bank campaign did was it focused on redlining, the redlining of especially African-American neighborhoods in the United States. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with redlining. It's a systematic denial of services by federal agencies, local governments, banks, and stores to people in communities that are considered to be high risk or bad investments. In other words, not profitable to the banks. And what's not only unfair about that is that it obviously keeps people systematically in a structure of lack of access, lack of privilege, poverty, lack of education, lack of jobs, inability to buy homes, supermarkets being absent from these areas, so healthy food is absent, etc. So what's unfair beyond those things is that the people who live in these communities put their money in these banks, and then the banks don't reinvest in the communities, don't assist the depositors. And so redlining, as again you probably know, comes from the practice of the banks in taking maps of cities and drawing red lines around the areas that they considered high risk. And they're invariably populated by minority populations, especially African American. So the first map is on Philadelphia, and it's a map from 1936. Well, guess what? Here's a map of Baltimore. I'm at Loyola University in Baltimore, Maryland, not the one in Chicago or LA or New Orleans. But Baltimore is still, this is the effects of redlining. I mean, it's not legal to redline anymore, but the effects remain ever present. And I think it's interesting that the map was made showing this in 2015. So there were older maps, but in 2015, they say, look, this is how the redlining still works. And this particular neighborhood, does the cursor show up when I share screen?
Yes.
Okay, this is the neighborhood where Freddie Gray lived. Freddie Gray, as you may know, because he's been such a subject of the Black Lives Matter movement, was the African-American man, 25 years old, who was killed by the police in Baltimore in 2015. And here is his redline neighborhood. So I think it's a very stark example of the lack of access to resources that people in these neighborhoods have. So the bank campaign back in the 1970s and 80s that was focusing on apartheid drew in African communities in solidarity by showing them that the banks that they were putting their money in, Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, they weren't getting loans from these banks, but these banks instead were making loans to the apartheid government and corporations. So the protests, and there are many, many protests that took place across the country, and I've just included a few pictures, especially those that join the issues of redlining US cities and saying redline apartheid South Africa and not Washington, D.C. So this is a big bank that's in Washington, D.C. This is back in 1979 when I first got involved in the movement. Here's another one. Prexy and I have a friend who's on the left here. That's a woman named Carolyn Long, who has also devoted her life and still is to African solidarity issues. And I think that's me. I mean, I got this picture. It's not a personal photograph. I got it from the African Activist Archive. And that's one of the resources with the links I sent to Tabby. And so I downloaded the Briggs Bank Cam and I thought, oh my goodness, I think that's me. Anyway, the next one is Prexy back in the 1970s. This is outside Citibank.
Lord Almighty.
Yeah, Lord Almighty.
Skinny in those days.
And this is the man who, as I remember him, who recruited me into the anti-apartheid movement. And he's outside Citibank in New York City there. And again, I got this from the African Activist Archive Project, which is a really, really, really wonderful source for documents, primary documents and photographs on Africa that's housed at Michigan State University. But great website, easy to find things. Now, what the banks were doing in South Africa was they were assisting the government and the corporations in essentially making the apartheid system run. And again, most of you probably know what apartheid is, but just in case, it's again a systematic denial of the African population of citizenship. They were not considered citizens in South Africa. They were forced by law to live on reserves, which are very similar to the Native American Indian reservations. Well, they called them Indian reservations when they were started. The Native American reservations, which in one way we could say, well, it's a haven where they have some rights that were given to them by treaty, although most of them are disrespected. But it also has turned into a reservoir of poverty and lack of access to education, jobs, healthcare, et cetera. So while it's promoted as protecting them, in fact, it isn't. It's ghettoizing them, and that's exactly what went on in apartheid South Africa. And they even called them reserves. So they were forced to live in reserves. They were allowed to come out of the reserves only if they had government-recognized jobs and government-recognized housing in the so-called white areas. And so they were allowed out to work for the white-dominated economy. So it was, the reserves were used as a sort of labor pool, labor reserve for white corporations, farms, etc. People who came out had to carry ID documents that were called passes that indicated where they lived, where they had the right to be. And it was a criminal offense if their pass was out of order and they could be arrested and deported. So the reserves were also used as dumping grounds for people who were considered, and this word was actually used in the apartheid jargon, superfluous appendages to the white-dominated economy. So a dumping ground for women, children, the aged, the infirm, disabled workers sent back to the reserves. The bank loans allowed the government to develop the systems to run the prisons, to run the pass laws, to administer the reserves, etc. And so these were American bank loans and bank loans from European banks as well. So this is something that the bank campaign tried to publicize, and again to draw in church groups, African American communities, trade unions, to focus on the crimes the banks were committing at home and abroad. And what then happened is that the banks, the bank campaign and the divestment movement trying to get corporations to withdraw from South Africa became the focus of legislation, state and local governments, and ultimately the federal government, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. And the idea was that, the strategy was to try to put pressure on the banks to stop making loans and the corporations to withdraw by using our investments and our bank accounts as weapons against the banks and corporations, promoting bad publicity. So again, Prexy was a leader in this, and I sort of followed along to testify before various state governments that were considering legislation to remove public employee pension funds, university endowments, et cetera, from banks doing business in South Africa. City governments did the same thing. Big unions, oh my gosh, AFSCME was a leader in this, and also the healthcare workers. The state of California took billions of dollars out of banks and corporations doing business in South Africa. And the banks and corporations did ultimately start to leave. And part of it was the bad PR, that it was just considered too much of a hassle to stay there and get all this bad publicity. But it's also the case that they began to leave when the economy crumbled, not only under the pressure of the bad publicity, but the massive popular uprising that occurred across South Africa in the mid-1980s. And then it became more acceptable to say, oh, we're leaving. And that was when the Congress, US Congress, was able to finally get some kind of anti-apartheid legislation, some kind of divestment legislation through. And they passed it over Ronald Reagan's veto, right? So it was not an easy struggle, and it was a struggle that had been going on since the 1940s. But at any rate, it was ultimately successful, and this strategy of solidarity between African American communities and Africa was very important in making that happen. The next one, because I do want to bring it up to something that's sort of more recent, that students might be a little bit more familiar with. I mean, I think they ought to be familiar with this history too of the civil rights movement and the anti-apartheid movement. But also, there are these ongoing issues. This is not just in the past, and I think it's really important to say that. So I hope my terminology doesn't get too confused here. I go back and forth between calling it the Keystone XL pipeline, and I'll sometimes refer to the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Dakota Access Pipeline is a part of this larger Keystone XL pipeline that went from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And the portion that I'm going to focus on in terms of the protest is the portion that went between North and South Dakota. Here we go, North and South Dakota. Here's South Dakota, it goes up into North Dakota. And then it came on down because this portion drew massive protests that were started by the Standing Rock so-called Sioux, or Lakota more appropriately, the Standing Rock Sioux reservation. So this was a pipeline that was bringing oil out of Canada across the United States. It went under the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers at some point. It went under lakes. It went very close by the reservations. And it became a great cause for concern in terms of the impact it would make if there were leaks or breaks or spillages, that it would contaminate waters, it would destroy Native American sacred burial sites, it would destroy archaeological sites. There were 380 Native American archaeological sites that were identified as potentially at risk if the oil spilled. Okay. This is a picture of this, the pipeline facility here in the US, and this is the beginning of the protests. So in 2016, so this is really pretty recently, grassroots Native American movements and their supporters organized to oppose the construction of this pipeline, which was a project of Energy Transfer Partners, which is a Texas-based company. And they were specifically targeting the Dakota Access portion that I mentioned. The federal government was involved in this, even though this is a private concern that's profiting from this, because the pipeline was running through a lot of federal lands. And as I'm sure you know, there's been a lot of conflict in the west of the US over residents of states that have a lot of federal land. The residents, at least in the white communities, often want to use the federal land, and they pay very little rent for it, but they don't want any kind of environmental restrictions that might restrict their profits. And so this has been a real standoff between the states' rights and federal rights people, and the environmental rights versus economic business rights. But too often forgotten is the impact on Native Americans, who, as I've said already, are often living on these reservations, and have treaty rights, but that are really often ignored. So in 2016, youth from the Standing Rock Reservation and the surrounding Native American communities organized a campaign called Respect Our Water. So res as in reservation, R-E-S, spect our water, to stop the pipeline. And they did things like organized a 2,000-mile run from the reservation in North Dakota to Washington, D.C., where they delivered petitions to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that was helping to build the pipeline. The petitions had 160,000 signatures. So this is a protest. It's actually in San Francisco. I wasn't able to find any that were on the reservation. And by the way, all of the photographs and maps that I've used in this PowerPoint are in the common domain. In other words, there's no violation of copyright here. And the links I sent to Tavi for these photographs and many, many others are common domain photographs, because I figured as teachers, you're probably trying to be careful of that, just not sort of finding things on the web that look good and maybe violating copyright. So these are all public access. So this is in San Francisco, but it's very clear that there are some Native Americans involved, although a lot of allies in the non-Native American communities, and standing with Standing Rock Sioux. And then once again, Sioux is the outsider's name for the Lakota people, right? So it's the same thing. Here again is a member of the Lakota Nation, who's talking about protecting the sacred burial grounds that are going to be jeopardized by this pipeline. A Native American woman who's involved in the protests as well. And again, honor treaty rights. So the signs and banners vary between honoring the Native Americans and their rights and focusing on what the environmental issues are, protecting the water, protecting people's health. Water is life, agua es vida, etc. Now, what happened when the protests began is that the Native Americans and their supporters began to establish encampments that ultimately included thousands of people, 3,000 to 4,000 resistance supporters. And the authorities bulldozed the sacred land. They tried to scatter people from the encampments, the National Guard, private security personnel hired by the oil company, police with riot gear and military equipment. They used water cannons and dogs, so very much reminiscent of what was done to civil rights workers and protesters in the US in the 1950s and 60s. I should note that Dayton County, Wisconsin, the sheriff's office sent 10 deputies to aid the local police at Standing Rock, and they were recalled within days due to the resistance of Dayton County residents and officials. Dayton County is the county where Madison, Wisconsin is, so I can imagine, and that's the capital of Wisconsin and also the home of the sort of flagship university. So they were protesting the fact that their deputies were sent to support the police. The U.S. military veterans started a group called Veterans for Standing Rock to protect demonstrators from assault and intimidation at the hands of militarized police, and that was a quote. I should note here that Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza made a big point about this. She's noted the difference in police response when in 1916 armed right-wing protesters occupied the headquarters of the Oregon Malheur National Wildlife Refuge And again, this was a states' rights versus federal rights issue. And she said, if you're white, you can occupy federal property and get found not guilty. No tear gas, no tanks, no rubber bullets. If you're indigenous and fighting to protect our earth and the water we depend on to survive, you get tear gassed, media blackouts, tanks. So again, reminiscent of the US anti-apartheid campaign, a number of cities, I think it was 19 from the source that I looked at, passed ordinances supporting Standing Rock and the Native American people in opposition to the pipeline. Also reminiscent of the bank campaigns were campaigns against the banks that were financing the pipeline. Wells Fargo, which has a lot of discredit to its name and shame these days, but it was one of the big funders, and this was particularly targeted. And the Davis City, California City Council voted to terminate its relations with Wells Fargo as a result of the lending to the oil pipeline, and it moved its accounts elsewhere. All right, so under the Obama administration, so that was the last year of the Obama administration, there was a move to reassess the environmental impact. The Obama administration ordered that the pipeline construction be stopped while these were going on. When Trump took office, within days, he started up the pipeline construction again. He canceled the environmental assessments, and the pipeline was completed. Oil began to flow. In July 2020, there was yet more legal action where a district court judge ruled that the pipeline had to be shut down and emptied of its oil, and the environmental impact statements had to start again. An appeals court, however, overturned the shutdown order, but did say there must be an environmental review. So this is still an ongoing struggle. Let's see my time here. Okay, I do have time to go on to Africa again, which I really wanted to do. Good. So the parallel here is not Africans supporting Native American communities, but just showing how the same corporations that are doing these things in the United States also have an impact, a very negative impact in Africa. So in this case, I'm going to focus on the Niger Delta, which is down here at the bottom of the map. This is the whole Niger River, very major river in Africa, and this is the Delta region, which is in southeastern Nigeria. Now, Nigeria, which is this, is, as you may know, a country that has experienced a lot of divisions, regional divisions, ethnic divisions, religious divisions, and outsiders have played a lot of role in stoking and creating many of these conflicts. But Nigeria, after independence, had a number of military governments, and most of the military officers who led the governments came from the north, and they came from a particular ethnic group and a particular class in the ethnic group. However, most of the wealth of Nigeria comes from its vast oil resources, which are found in the Niger Delta region. And so this area, which could be incredibly rich, is one of the most impoverished regions in Nigeria because the wealth is extracted by foreign oil companies, used for the profits of the oil companies back in their home countries. And what's left over for Nigeria was used by the military regimes and corrupt government officials to develop the north. So once again, the local inhabitants who have the wealth are not the ones who are benefiting from it. So like the bank campaigns of the anti-apartheid movement. Like the Keystone XL pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline situation, there are incredible environmental issues and problems that are related to this. The oil industry negligence has resulted in massive pollution of the Delta's air and waterways. And just to give you one small example, you may remember or you may have read about the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. which dumped 10.8 million gallons of oil into Alaskan waters. And until the Deepwater Horizon spill, it was one of the largest in US history. It caused horrific environmental and economic damage. To put that in perspective, Western oil companies have contaminated the Niger Delta with the equivalent of one Exxon Valdez spill every year for the past half century, right? So every year for 50 years, they have been dumping that much oil into the Niger Delta area. This has destroyed the fishing and agricultural industries. It's really killing the Delta. And this means that the people's main sources of livelihood have been destroyed. The region is marked by immense poverty and unemployment, and few local residents are even employed by the oil companies. Well, so to give you a sense of the underdevelopment, the poverty, only a fraction of the Delta can be reached by road, and most of those are unpaved. The majority of villages have no electricity, running water, plumbing, or sewage systems. Local people drink, fish, bathe, and defecate in the water that is also polluted by oil spills and illegal pipeline tapping. This has enormous and detrimental health ramifications. So the protests. This particular protest, you can see signs that talk about the environmental damage, that the gas flaring is polluting the air and causing asthma and greenhouse gases that in turn cause global warming. But there's also a focus on no blood for oil, and a picture of a man in some of these posters. And the man whose picture is shown is a man named Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was a leader of these protests and of a movement called the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP. Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other leaders were arrested in the 1990s, early 1990s, arrested by the Nigerian government and charged and convicted of murder on trumped up charges. There is absolutely no evidence to support this, that they were engaged in murder. Nonetheless, they were hanged in 1975. These 9 leaders were hanged. And Shell Oil was targeted not only for failing to intervene, failing to use its clout with the government to stop the bogus trial and then the travesty of the executions, but for its implicit acceptance of the government's actions and even downright complicity. I mean, there is even evidence of complicity. So that's what those signs mean. And then, of course, the blood is also the blood of the people who are dying because of the diseases and the pollution and the lack of industry and agriculture now. So these protests are in Nigeria. So these photographs actually do come from Nigeria. In this state, the Yelza state in the Niger Delta. And again, emphasis on the damages that fossil fuels are causing, as well as some of the political issues. So this group, MOSOP, Ken Saro-Wiwa's group, was the first of a number of locally based organizations that fought for a share of the region's oil wealth. They were nonviolent. They included thousands of women, I should note, lots and lots of women. They targeted Shell and Chevron and other transnational oil companies. They asked for reparations. So again, reminiscent of movements now that are asking for reparations for slavery. They asked for jobs, for potable water, electricity, scholarships, medical aid, and microcredit to help women establish businesses. The companies did make some concessions, but they also responded with violence. Like the Energy Transfer Partners, that builder of the Keystone XL pipeline, the Niger Delta hired security guards, private security companies that worked with the Nigerian military and police to protect their business interests. Foreign oil companies provided helicopters and boats to the security forces, and the local people have been beaten, arrested, and fired upon unarmed people. There have been subsequently some armed gangs. There have been some armed movements that have also joined in the protests, but I think it should be stressed that by far the majority of the protests were nonviolent by local community organizations. Who are these security guards? Well, some of them are local youths, unemployed youths who are hired by the companies and turned against their own people. So this is another strategy that we see a lot. We saw that a lot in apartheid South Africa, that local people who are desperate for jobs are hired as military and police and turned against their own people. And so these local security guards have been terrorizing the population along with the military and the police. They've also fought amongst one another. Criminal groups have begun to fight over the oil that it's called oil bunkering, where they break into the pipelines and tap it, and then they sell the oil illicitly, often to corrupt Nigerian military and police officials. So that is the protest in the Niger Delta, just again to show you that there are these allies outside of the Niger Delta. This is in London in 2008. Again, targeting the role of outsiders in what's going on in Nigeria. In this case, it's Britain, the US, and China that are being fingered as being the culprits. And these are predominantly Nigerians also in London. So people living in London, but from Nigeria, who are also protesting. In this case, they're opposing the prospect of the United Kingdom providing military assistance to Nigeria that would be used in the Niger Delta. So it's Nigerians, and you can see some probably British supporters in there as well. Another picture of that, and the political prisoners, Henry Oka, who was in prison for his protests. And then finally, and Tavi does have these. I can also share it with anyone who wants it. If Tavi wants to give people my email address, I welcome that. But these are websites. I won't open them because I don't want to take time from our question and answers. But these are websites that I found particularly useful for this kind of work. I've already mentioned the African Activist Archive Project, which has great stuff on the anti-apartheid movement, Southern African solidarity more broadly, pictures, pamphlets, newspaper articles, reports. Many of you may be familiar with the Zinn Education Project. It has great resources for teachers on US history, a kind of alternative view. And if you go to that website and put Africa in, you'll also find some great Africa resources. The photographs I mentioned come from the African Activist Archive Project, and then Wikimedia Commons and Flickr Creative Commons. So again, to avoid violating copyright, these are great sources, really rich troves of photographs. So I'm going to unshare the screen. There we go. All right. So I guess we're ready for the Q&A. Is that right, Tavi?
Yes, or I can share some resources.
Oh, right.
Why don't we, okay, I'll go in to some resources and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I will go very quickly through my PowerPoint because we are going to share this PowerPoint out to you, and you will have those hard links that you can use. So let me go ahead and do that now. Okay. All right, and so thinking about it in a number of ways, to think about, how do we put this into a course, right? How do you start talking about these things with your students? Right now, I am actually teaching a course to freshmen, and so I am getting your former students. And one of the very first things I do in an Introduction to Africa course is I ask them to close their eyes and just very freely associate with what comes to their mind when I say the term Africa. Okay. And it probably is no surprise to you that this is what I get,
Yeah.
right? And this has been consistent for 20 years, okay?
Oh.
This is not what students see. And when I follow with this image, they are shocked. And this year, you know, some of them said, you know, we knew, and sorry, I've got dogs. We knew there were cities in Africa, but really, this is how we still think of it. As Africa is all savannas, animals, and a few tribes running around, scared of animals. And yet they know in the back of their mind that this is Africa, or that there are cities in Africa, but they get no information. In a class of 26 this year, I had 2 students who'd had any information on Africa. And one was on the Rwanda genocide, and one was on poverty and children starving in Africa. That was it. And I want you to think about our tropes of the continent of Africa and why those might have been the only topics, right? So we have to somehow start to think from our students' perspective and from their parents. You know, it's really interesting. I always have them interview their parents or their grandparents to see what their perspectives are in Africa and try and find commonalities, right? And so, you know, thinking about cities, for myself being in Indiana, you know, I asked them, you know, look, what is Indiana? It's cities surrounded by farmland. And in fact, that is exactly what we find in Africa, right? Cities surrounded by farmlands. So try and make that connection, however you are, right? We need to start talking and showing images of the diversity of the 1.3 billion people on this continent and the diversity of individuals who live out of that continent, the African diasporas, right? Because it's more than one diaspora, it is generations of diasporas. And really thinking about, you know, for your students, how big is Africa? It's astounding when they start to see these images that, you know, that continent is huge, because our old maps, of course, enlarge the North and shrink the global South, literally in those old maps. And so we have to start changing those images, changing those narratives. And again, you will have access to this PowerPoint. But because our students are not taught about Africa, it becomes a blank slate. And that means ideas of what we think we know about Africa become prioritized. And that can be incredibly problematic, right? Here, you know, these are actual images of Tanzania. And then in comparison with Western perspectives, the image of what people want when they go to Tanzania, circa 2019, and compare it to 1930s, okay? So our perspective as Americans and Westerners has little changed. We really get our ideas of Africa from colonial narratives, which of course are incredibly racist. And this latent knowledge has manifest consequences, right? We may laugh at 2017 with Trump inventing the country of Nambia as he sat with political leaders from across the continent of Africa. Or we may shake our heads and groan when he stated that he lets all his friends know how they can make money off of Africa. Think about that in connection, right, with the historical grabbing and scramble for Africa. But then, you know, in 2018, he called all countries on the continent and Haiti shithole countries, right? We're all adults here, right? And so here we have an individual who is the president of the last superpower in the United States, who has power over trade, immigration, security, and other political decisions. And he's making, you know, political decisions through these latent ideas. And, you know, we may laugh at these and think, well, this is so significant, but let's go back a little bit. Let's think about Francois Mitterrand, who, as the Prime Minister of France, stated with regards to the Rwandan genocide doesn't really happen or doesn't really matter in some areas of the world. So so an ignoring of the consequences of genocide because it's happening in a country in Africa, right? So latent ideas have manifest consequences. And if we think that these ideas are not prevalent, they absolutely are. The science shows that there are not races, there is one race. And yet popular consciousness, popular knowledge lags so far behind in our sciences. So that in 2019, we can still be talking about the resilience of scientific legacy. We can have a cover of National Geographic that's talking about we need to look at race, right? This is 2019, and yet we've known for many decades that there is no such thing as races. It is melatonin, right? So this is why there's a number of reasons, why we're seeing resonance of Black Lives Matter movements across the world. And there's some very good resources out there. It is a shared history of colonialism, of control over human bodies, of control over human minds, control over human languages even. It is police brutality that is widespread in the United States that resonates because it is widespread among certain governments in Africa, such as SARS, police brutality, the End SARS movement right now going on in Nigeria. It resonates because of continued inequalities of income, class, and race. And in Africa, colorism. So what color is your skin from where you live? And systemic issues, systemic institutionalized issues that go back to colonialism that really hasn't ended. So I've got a number of really wonderful resources here. Again, I will be providing these links for you and this PowerPoint, but there is a wonderful Voice of Africa interview. It's about an hour long, but it's on Black Lives Matter in Africa, and it can give you a solid foundation. And it interviews individuals both in the US, Black Lives Matter movements, and those heading movements on the continent. As well, I've got some short articles that explain why George Floyd's death resonated, and the SARS movement here for you. As well, if you are teaching US history and stating, well, how can I, there's nothing I can do, I can't teach Africa. There are incredible parallels with, for example, Jim Crow laws of racism and segregation in South Africa. And indeed, white minority leaders looked to the United States and Jim Crow laws for examples of how to do apartheid. So I have some resources for you. PBS, for example, has very short articles and videos that you can use, as well as Elizabeth. I've put down the African Activist Archive here. An image of Miriam Makeba, who was an international activist. As well, teach history through empathy, right? Your students know of Nelson Mandela's name, but I can guarantee you they never knew that he was in prison for 27 years of his life. My students don't know the term apartheid. They don't know that Nelson Mandela was ever imprisoned. And so sharing that story, his personal story, can resonate with them. As well, there are powerful accounts, as you saw with Elizabeth's presentation, of activism in the US. This is a very short clip of about 4 minutes of then Senator Biden impassionately railing against the fact that the US had done nothing to fight apartheid in South Africa. And I think it'll resonate with your students because of the election cycle this year. And I don't think I have to proselytize to you about why Africa, why care, why now, but just to give some images and some facts that maybe you can take to your administrators, right, about why Africa should be taught in your courses. In 2017, population estimates for the African continent were to reach 1.2 billion by 2050, but the actual population now is 1.3 billion. By 2030, half of the world's population growth will occur on the continent. And by 2080, 40% of the world's population will be Africa born. Are your students Africa literate? Urban Africa, right? Almost half of the continent, people live in cities, and they live lives and deal with issues of any city. By 2030, 7 of 10 city dwellers in the world will be African or Asian. So on the African continent or in China. By 2050, Africa will be home to 10 megacities of 156 million or more. And this has consequences for us. It truly does. We could talk about migration, for example, but we could also talk about climate change. There are 34 designated hotspots of biodiversity around the world, and many lie in Africa. 2.3% of the land surface of the Earth house 50% of the plant species and 40% of terrestrial species. All are threatened due to human activities from global climate change. On the continent of Africa, most people live on the coast, where biodiversity, as you can see on this map in the red areas, is greatest. And we see that urbanization is directly tied to the loss of biodiversity and diversity even of languages, of cultures. So when we're looking at these heightening of population, we have to link it to climate change. We have to link it to biodiversity and loss. We have to think about global integration. And this is a wonderful interactive map from Harvard's Urban Lab. And Harvard has actually concentrated on Africa because of the rate of urbanization. It's higher than anywhere else in the world. And it is higher and faster than China developed in the past 20 years. In fact, when we're looking at global economies, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. You know, are your students ready for global jobs that may take them to work with Africans on the continent? Here, Wired, Forbes magazine, they understand this. And, you know, these are older articles highlighting technology and global markets and the fact that you better be literate and you better be working with your African colleagues. So why teach Africa? Teach for your students, right? We need to have histories that are relevant for all our students in our classrooms. I've been working with fellow teachers in Indiana, and I'm very happy to say that we have the first, because of Jim Augustine, who I believe is on this call, but because of Jim Augustine, we have the very first semester-long high school course on African history. And that this is so important, especially for those of you who work in urban environments and are teaching a majority minority school population. They need to see these histories. And we need students who are global. And as we started with Prexy, with this quote from Mashal, international solidarity is not an act of charity, it is an act of unity. So on here, I've got a number of resources for you. Primary and secondary documents, current events, how to link current events in history, Jim Crow and apartheid, also some wonderful books. Your students know Trevor Noah. And Trevor Noah's book, I shared it in class, and one of the students raised their hand and said, wait a minute, apartheid sounds like what Trevor Noah's talking about. And absolutely, you got it. He was born at the end of apartheid. So we need these layers of linking lived lives and experiences, and they have a children's edition and young child's edition of his biography now. We've got broader resources for teachers. You know, what to do if you're just getting into Africa. I've got a book here called Mistaking Africa that I've actually used as a textbook for my students. And then if you want one TED Talk for a high school class, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story will blow their minds and blow their minds about the ideas of Africa. So I'll stop there so that we can use the rest of our time for dialogue. Thank you. All right, and so I'd like to open it up to you. We had a few questions. from our teachers, and that included questions specifically for Elizabeth. I will actually send those to Elizabeth because they were high up in the chat. So Elizabeth, one of the questions was, with regards to the XL pipeline, has tort law been weakened to limit the risk of such a development? I.e., if a leak were to occur, are there limits on the lawsuit that could follow?
Oh my goodness, I am afraid I'm not that much of an expert to be able to say that, but I would imagine that's something that could be found relatively easily on the internet. Um, I don't know if there are limitations on the amount. Does anyone else know? I mean, anyone else following it? Yeah.
I'd suggest that they look on the internet for the National Lawyers Guild, and the National Lawyers Guild has a unit on this very question.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Prexy. Another question or a contemplation was, I wonder what makes Alaska and Nigeria so different in terms of the response to oil spills?
Well, Nigeria in the 1990s, when Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other MOSOP leaders were executed, was a military government. So that's one thing. It was under military law, and that ended in 1999. But Nigeria is still a place with a great deal of corruption and a great deal of abuse of civilian populations by the military and police. In the Niger Delta still, but also right now in northeastern Nigeria, where Boko Haram is, that one of the reasons that the U.S. has not been able to give as much military aid as it wanted in the so-called war on terror is because of the abuse of the civilian populations by the military. And we have somehow skirted that, although there are fears that we're losing our democratic institutions, or there were greater fears before. But in Alaska, they even the Native American reservations in the Dakotas, people were killed, yes, just as in Black Lives Matter protests, we learned about the many African Americans who've been killed. But it is contrary to the law. We do know that a lot of times the police aren't held to account. But in fact, we do have institutions that are supposed to protect the civilians, whereas Nigeria is short of many of those institutions.
So here's another question, and Prexy, you have this incredibly long lived history. You might be able to talk about it. Any more information about grassroots or quote unquote mainstream political forces and solidarity movements, for example, anti-apartheid with state and federal legislation in the United States, specifically, for example, the role of the Congressional Black Lives Caucus, pitfalls, limitations?
There is indeed a long history. And I was going to say that one of the things that I think people should also look for is to look for certain consistent patterns throughout. If we're just talking about the whole question of Gulf, of oil, and of the spoiling of the environment in Nigeria, but this has gone on also in Angola, for example. Mm-hmm. It's also going on now in the east coast of Mozambique, on the off of the coast of northern Mozambique. There's a whole history, and there's a lot of material that has been published about it, of the environmental ruin by multinational corporations. The other thing I'd recommend to you is that you take a good look at what's available from European sources and African sources. More and more, there's great information and material being published that is now available, that is coming from these sources. There are great films that are available. I can't remember, I'm trying to think of this ridiculous film that showed at one point in the United States that involves this guy, and it was about, he makes this horrible comment about Africa. Africa is a disaster or something like that. this was, I can't remember the name of the film, but there are a lot of fantastic films. One resource that we didn't mention that is really consistent and great is a great website called Africa is a Country.
Mhm.
It's a
Mhm.
very,
Yes.
very good website that you should turn to. And then the work of a wonderful man named William Minter, who's run a, what is Bill's web?
Africa Focus, it's called Africa Focus Bulletin.
Yeah, I would recommend that you all get on those websites regularly and just have those things come regularly to you. For instance, one of the other things happening right now is Africa is on the edge of another major kind of war that may hit in the Horn of Africa right now.
Mhm.
And so one wants to make sure that we don't play a role in making that worse. It's a war involving Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the Tigray people. It's a very bad situation. So I'm just urging that we try to use resources that go far beyond just what's available in the United States.
Absolutely. And I have Africa as a Country and some of these other resources again embedded in that PowerPoint that we will be sharing out. Okay. And let's see if I'm looking for other questions. Yes, number of countries the UN does not recognize Western Sahara. So I've got, Rebecca asked about other sources to learn about NSAR's movement and other grassroots movements currently on the continent. I have some of those links in that PowerPoint, but Africa is a country, is, as Prexy said, a wonderful resource for very up-to-date news. And also, you can follow them on Instagram, and it will link to current programs they're doing. If there's an issue, they will put that up there. Quartz Africa is another resource if you're interested in news. If you teach economics. If you are teaching any business classes, it has a lot of really good interviews and links Africa globally. So you want to look for those resources that embed Africa as part of world history, right? Past and present. And unfortunately, so often Africa has been removed out of history and Africans have been removed as agents of history. And so exposing your students to these contemporary events, showing that there is resistance and giving them that history of resistance and voices is incredibly important. I have a resource in my PowerPoint as well that gives you first person short writings so that you can turn to African voices in your classes. And it's not always, people like us, right? Or outsiders or news reporters who are just parachuting into a country for a couple of days to write a newsletter or a news report. It's individuals who have lived those experiences. So you can seek out those resources.
I think one other thing that,
Yes, please, Elizabeth.
Sorry. So Prexy mentioned Africa Focus Bulletin, which I put in the chat, just the name by Bill Minter, William Minter. He does have an issue on the NSARS campaign, a recent issue. You can get his weekly emails for free, but you can also go direct on the website to look what you're particularly interested in. His specialty is using sources from on the ground spots in Africa, whether it be media or interviews, links to films. So it's a really, really wonderful alternative source that's not the mainstream US or even European media. So just to reiterate what Prexy was saying, just about any issue you want, you can find an issue of his weekly bulletin on this.
I wanted to say too, Tavi, if I may, I like that that map that you had in your in your material you're going to send out later. But I have to say to you, in all the courses I teach, a requirement I have is the students have to learn the countries of Africa and the
Yes.
capitals. It's a requirement. I'm known on many campuses that you can't pass Nesbitt's course unless you learn the map of Africa. And this freaks
Yes.
students out, because then one of the things I do is make this a big game. And I'll say in the first session, you have to know the countries and capitals of Africa, and they're freaked. Then I'll say, but if there's somebody in the class who can give me all the states and capitals of the United States and do it right now, you won't have to learn them. So it becomes this little contest, and invariably, some macho man in the class will say, oh, I know them all, I know them all. And he'll try to do it and he will fail. And the whole class will get riveted. It's a way of bringing them in, but it's also a way of getting them engaged in understanding Africa from a different perspective than that one that has been that came out of this pathetic president we had, that he
Yes.
just voiced the sentiment that most Americans have, most view. Most of them don't say as stupidly as he does, but that is the perspective that most have. For instance, I have found that when students often do this blank map, they take any countries they can't pronounce the name of, and they will identify them as being part of the continent of Africa. So that for example, I've seen students give me back map tests that will list Czechoslovakia on, anything that's challenging for them. So we got to break through that American lack of, it's really a fundamental block to understanding international issues. It's bigger than just Africa.
Yeah, and Prexy, if I can add to it, so my students get the map lecture, which is filled with maps, right? And it starts, with, and it includes maps of trade out of Africa, circa 1200. And it shows, trade networks that were into China and Southeast Asia. But what you just said is incredibly important, right? And it leads to looking back at the history of map making and cartography, and how colonialism used these narratives to separate Africa from the rest of the world. Why is it our students don't know Egypt is on the continent of Africa? It's because Egypt had a civilization that could not be denied by Westerners. And so they use Egypt as a precursor to European history. They link the Greeks and the Romans and Europe, rather than showing, we can go back, we can look at migrations out of the Sahara. When the Sahara started drying up from a green Sahara to becoming what it is today, peoples there migrated across the continent to the Nile and southward to the Niger River. And it became two major cultural hearths on the continent of Africa. But look at that map again, right? Egypt, there's no separation with the Arabian Peninsula, right? There's no separation. There's a reason why Islam, Muhammad sent individuals to Ethiopia in his lifetime. There's a reason why Islam and Christianity were on the continent of Africa within a decade, right? Those are indigenous ancient religions, if you will. Look at Spain. There's a reason why we have migrants from Africa going to Spain. There is literally hardly any space between Spain and North Africa. And yet the colonial narrative was, get rid of North Africa, use sub-Saharan Africa, and you can talk about a quote unquote dark Africa or a dark continent, and disassociate from the rest of the world. But why were the Portuguese in the 1400s wanting to get to Africa? It's because they knew of Africa because of places like Timbuktu, centers of trade, wealth, and knowledge, right? That Europeans had only heard of, but these other areas of the world had been trading with, okay? So maps are incredibly important. And I'm happy to share the map lecture with y'all. I see that you all are sharing resources, and that's wonderful. These are a lot of resources that I also use. And again, I'm glad to see some of you are already using Kimes Mistaking Africa and Adichie's writings. She's really incredible.
Mm.
Other questions? We have about 10 more minutes.
Could I say one other thing, Tabby?
Absolutely. Take the floor.
I've been running for many years an organization called Making the Road. And we take students on trips to Africa. And obviously right now we can't do any of that, sadly. But I've found that it has been one of the most opening modalities and ways of exciting students to not only just work on Africa issues, but to work also on all of the questions that we are engaged in this world today. I took a group of students from Black Lives Matter organizations to South Africa at the point that the South Africans were looking at similar questions of monuments of that were saluting apartheid and colonialism, like on the campus of the University of Cape Town, there was a big statue of a man called Rhodes, who was a great colonialist, after whom the country Rhodesia was named. And that statue was taken down. And when my students were there, they were busy talking with the students from South Africa about that question of what do you do with these old memorials to colonialism and conquest. And I think that I know a number of students who said that that time was amongst the most eye-opening periods in their whole lives. And I urge that that particularly in schools which are multiracial or biracial, or where there are small populations of people of color, that it be part of their being able to better survive the United States is getting them the exposure to travel to Africa. And lately we've been also going to Cuba and Brazil and then going to Africa. So we're kind of reversing historic patterns. And it's bringing our people back into history.
Thank you, Prexy. You know, we have a question here that I think is very important. It's from Amy. She says, I had asked this early if anyone has advice. My rural 99% white district posted resources for fostering discussions on racism on its website during the George Floyd protests. Community members saw that one of the resources mentioned BLM and wrote letters to our school board about the Marxist BLM founders and how we were presenting a one-sided story with our reading suggestions. What is the best approach or response to such responses?
Well, I think one thing is that they have no idea. This is a very popular presentation and attack on BLM. And they have no idea of the depth and the openness of BLM. I think that one of the things you would find, and I would urge those people to look at things like the platform that's online of the BLM. I would urge them to read the writings of the founders of BLM. And one of the things they will find is an openness and a non-racialism that is most exceptional for people in the United States. I'm very, very proud of the fact that as a former employee of the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Switzerland, we helped to fund the Cohambee River Collective, out of which came much of the ideas of the of the BLM and of Black Lives Matter. And I think that it's an attack on the BLM. That's all it is, to negate it. But the openness of BLM to international issues and its non-racialism is just amazing. It's astounding that it is so much that way. But it's also very much like the struggles for freedom on the African continent, that too are remarkable in their non-racialism, in their creating and being open to getting societies that are not a duplicate of what the Proud Boys would like to see created, or others that Trump relates to. So I think they teach a great deal. Africa has a lot to teach.
I think also just this idea of distorting and rewriting history is a really important one, just to pick up on what Prexy is saying, that to label someone, during the Cold War, it was the stooges of Moscow, the communists under every Bush, and anyone who wanted to fundamentally change the inequities of society was declared a Marxist or a communist. And similarly today, many of the indigenous protest movements in Africa are deemed not only by their governments, but by the United States and others to be terrorists, right? So terrorism is the new anti-communism. And so, as Prexy said, if you just show the evidence, these are the statements of Black Lives Matter. There is nothing in here that, is, proponent of violence or et cetera. But just this idea of besmirching somebody with a label, we do have to fight that.
Yeah, this seems to be happening. If you're looking at the chat right now, it is happening to a number of teachers. That even discussing BLM in classrooms has been banned in some ways.
It reminds me very much, Tavi, of the banning of discussing ANC. In the beginning,
Yes.
You could not discuss the ANC. You could not discuss Nelson Mandela. So I kind of get tickled when I go to places and they talk about how much they were really supporting Nelson Mandela in his early days. No, that's not the case.
Yeah. In fact,
the same thing. They were banned items, banned people. They could not be discussed. And I remember, for instance, meeting a wonderful, wonderful man by the name of Beyers Naudé, an Afrikaner. He was a white Afrikaner. And if you have a chance, look him up. And I would love to see people read the life of this devout leader at one point of the Council of Churches of South Africa, an Afrikaner, who also completely supported and gave every bit of his life to the fight to end apartheid. And he's one of the great heroes of today's South Africa.
I would echo that about Beyers Naudé for sure. But also the ANC was named by the U.S. government a terrorist organization. So, TAVI students who know about Mandela but didn't know he'd gone to prison, they probably also don't know that he was on the U.S. government's terrorism watch list until 2008. I mean, he was released from prison in 1990. He became president of South Africa in 1994. In 2008, he's still technically on the terrorism watch list in terms of having to get special permission to come into the US. And the people who were, and Prexy mentioned this, and Tavi did as well, the people who were supporting that stance were often pro-segregation, Southern, long-standing members of Congress who had fought against integration, fought against the civil rights laws, the voting rights laws, et cetera, and really became the main support of the white minority regimes in both South Africa and Rhodesia. They were the lobbies that countered sanctions, that tried to describe anyone resisting these systems as being terrorists. So when people now have sort of, just as they have embraced Martin Luther King, I mean, the very forces that had tried to do him in, the same thing happened with Mandela, that everybody's running to, embrace this great man without acknowledging the role that they and like-minded people played in, keeping him imprisoned and designating him and sort of
And putting him in prison.
the CIA was
the role that the United States government played in capturing Nelson Mandela and jailing him. And when Madiba came for the first visit in 1990, he was asked, "Do you want to meet and discuss what they did to you?" He said, "No, that's past. That's over with. We're now at another page." And I think that's the kind of spirit that we don't learn about people like that very much in this country.
Yeah. So I've been alerted that we are out of time, and this is just an incredibly important conversation. And so again, you are welcome. My email's at the very top. You are welcome to email me. I can get you resources, and we can also share the resources after this as well. If you're teaching history, start teaching a global history. If your school system won't let you look at BLM, let's look at the history, right? And then your students will start to understand why there are all of these movements across the country. If they won't let you teach BLM, do SARS, right? Maybe your school system doesn't understand SARS. So you can look at these other more particularized movements to get around that, okay? So I thank you all so much. You are activating our students. And I thank you for spending the time with us today.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Abby, you're welcome to share with all this wonderful group my information too.
Yeah, and mine. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Tabby. Thank you, Prexy.
Thank you, Tabby. Thank you, Betsy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prexy. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Tabby. I'll be in touch with you soon.
Sounds good.